Disabling Buttons Accessibly, presented by Zoe Horton, AliCamp 2021. We'd like to thank our gold sponsors Telstra and Intopia, our silver sponsors ANZ and Coles, and our bronze sponsor How2.
Hi everyone, I'm super excited and honoured to be presenting this topic about disabling buttons inclusively. Today I'd like to present 3 different approaches for disabling buttons and to really raise questions and awareness around whether we're disabling them in a way that's not only accessible but usable for people with disabilities. So the 3 different approaches are: number 1, using the HTML disabled attribute; number 2, using an ARIA disabled attribute; and number 3 is not using a disable control at all. I'd like you to imagine the following scenario. You have a submit, send, or equivalent button that's disabled until the user has filled in all of the required fields. We see this functionality often in the wild, and it's done for very good reasons. It forces users to input relevant data, and it also prevents users from performing an invalid action. But the question is, are there any impacts in terms of accessibility and usability? And how do we ensure that disabled buttons are fully usable for all of our users? Would you believe me if I told you that you could have a fully accessible disabled button in terms of compliance with the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, or WCAG for short, but that it's unusable for many users with disabilities? On the slide, you can see 3 different scenarios. Number 1 is the worst case scenario, in which a button is neither accessible nor usable. The next scenario is where a button is accessible, but not particularly usable by everybody, or the experience itself is not very pleasant. And then the last scenario is what we're really aiming for with all of our digital products, and that's that they are accessible and usable and a pleasant experience. So let's take a look at the first approach to disabling a button. And this is using the HTML disabled attribute. So on the slide, we have a markup for 2 button elements, a reset and a submit button. And the submit button has the HTML disabled attribute applied. The visual results of this are that the submit button is dimmed or grayed out, and this is to indicate its disabled state, which is a good thing, right? Because this is intentional and useful for sighted users. We know not to try and activate that disable control based on its dimmed or grayed out appearance. They're usually low contrast disabled buttons by default. But are there any potential impacts that this can have on users with disabilities? The low contrast of a disabled button can affect and impact the following users: anybody with a vision impairment or low vision, colorblind users, and then just anybody using a mobile device in a bright or sunny location. The low contrast can actually render the button very difficult to read, or in some circumstances, impossible to even detect. On the slide is an example from Twitter. It's an example of the disabled tweet button. So it's been dimmed until the user enters text into the tweet text field. So it's a very light shade of blue. And the contrast ratio of this is only 1.6 to 1, whereas usually minimum contrast requirements for regular text is 4.5 to 1. So you can see there's a big difference in where the contrast should be. So same with Facebook. We have on the slide the dimmed or disabled post button, which is a very light gray against the background. And this has a contrast ratio of only 1.4 to 1. But wait a minute, disabled controls are exempt from WCAG, right? They don't have any color contrast requirements. Well, this is true. To quote the WCAG documentation, although it would be beneficial to some people to discern inactive controls, a one-size-fits-all solution has been very difficult to establish. A method of varying the presentation of disabled controls, such as maybe adding an icon, is anticipated as an advancement in the future. However, as it stands, disabled controls are exempt from WCAG color contrast requirements. But from a usability lens, and we want to create pleasant and usable experiences ultimately, right? These low contrast disabled controls can potentially be unusable by low vision and colorblind users. Are there any other users that are impacted? So no explicit reason is generally provided as to why a control is disabled. And although there is no explicit reason usually provided, most users can kind of figure out that a submit button that's not available, it's because the required fields haven't been filled in. But this may not be so obvious to all users, particularly those with learning difficulties or cognitive impairment. The question we need to ask is, can all users figure out what's required to continue? Or can they figure out why they're blocked from activating a button? There's a couple of examples of the Facebook and Twitter again on the slide, just illustrating that there's no indication, no explicit explanation of why the tweet and post button is disabled and dimmed. So unless that explanation is explicit, potentially this could affect users with cognitive impairment. And they could be left wondering why they're unable to activate a button or submit a form. What's the experience like for non-sighted users such as screen reader users? Using the HTML disabled attribute on a button automatically will take it out of the tab order. That means that it's no longer keyboard focusable. So screen reader users or keyboard users cannot tab to a disabled button. But isn't that the intention? Well, yes, but how does this impact on the experience for screen reader users? So I'm going to play a screen reader demonstration of what this experience could be like. So we have on the slide a form. It has two text inputs for name and email. It has a reset button, and it has a HTML disabled submit button. Now here is what a screen reader user will experience as they tab through the fields.
Name, edit text. Email, edit text. Reset, button. Link, privacy.
So you can see there that for sighted users, that visually dimmed submit button, we can figure out that it will be available when we've filled in those fields when relevant. but that same experience is not provided to a screen reader user. You could see from the demonstration and hear that it actually skipped over the submit button. So as they tab through these fields, they never focus on that disabled submit button unless they've entered text into those fields previously. So they won't even be aware that there is a submit button present. Now, to provide an equivalent experience, wouldn't it be better for screen reader users to know that that submit button is there, even though it's not available yet? So how can we improve on that experience? Is there a better method? Is there a more beneficial approach? Enter the ARIA disabled attribute. So this is our second approach. So by adding ARIA disabled equals true to a button element, as shown on the markup on the slide, what would be the benefits and potential impacts of this approach? Well, straight away, it's screen reader friendly because now that submit button is keyboard focusable. It can be tabbed to. And so once it's tabbed to, it will announce that it's dimmed or unavailable. And so a screen reader user is aware that it's there, but not available for interaction yet. So here's a demo of that experience with the submit button being disabled using the ARIA disabled attribute.
Name, edit text, email, edit text, reset, button, submit, dimmed button.
So the screen reader there tabbed to the submit button, it announced that it was dimmed. And so now they're getting the same experience as a sighted user. They know that there's a submit button, even though it's not available. And from talking to screen reader users daily in my work and life, this is what they often say is their preference, that they like to know that it's there and be aware, made aware, because it's focusable, even though they can't interact with it currently. So great, problem solved, right? Well, for screen readers, yes. But for visually impaired users, also, this is great. There's no longer any contrast issues because you'll notice from the slide, the reset and submit buttons, there's no difference between them. And that's because adding an ARIA disabled attribute to a button, it doesn't change its appearance at all. In fact, ARIA is used to communicate names, roles, states, attributes to assistive technologies such as screen readers. It doesn't change the appearance or behavior of a control. The problem with this approach, this second approach, is that sighted users, keyboard only and speech recognition users would have no way of knowing that this button is disabled because there's no visual distinction. So many users would be confused by a button whose visual appearance indicates that it's active, but when they attempt to submit the form by activating it, nothing would happen. And this second approach has a similar problem with the HTML disabled approach in that, again, there's never really an explicit reason provided why it's disabled. And so this also would impact on cognitively impaired users. So more would have to be implemented with this second approach in order to make it fully usable and accessible. So it's an improvement on the first approach, but additional implementation would have to be added. So these are the potential user impacts of this second approach. It would affect sighted users, keyboard users, speech recognition users, and cognitively impaired. So let's look at the kind of implementations that could improve this method. So some suggestions would be to use CSS to provide some visual distinction, but maintaining good contrast so that low vision users can still read and detect the button. Preventing any click action using JavaScript. Also indicating to mouse users that it's disabled by having the cursor not allowed attribute applied, so that when they hovered over the button, it would show that, that the cursor wouldn't be allowed. And then lastly, you could provide explicit reason why the button is disabled. So maybe before the form field, having a little statement saying all fields need to be filled in before you can submit, or something similar. But is there another approach other than these two approaches that would be a step up? Well, this brings us to our third and final approach, and that's the approach of not using the disabled button at all. So leaving the buttons active and then providing feedback if the users try to activate it before it's ready or before the required fields have been completed. So what are the benefits of this approach? Well, it's keyboard focusable, so there's no issue for a screen reader user or keyboard user to access it. There's no need to provide a visual distinction because it's not disabled, it's active. So there'd be no contrast issues between the two. The explanation as to why something can't be submitted is provided through validation instead. And what this does is it gives all users an equivalent experience. So they're getting the same experience regardless of their ability or disability. So you can see on the slide there, we have that original form with first name, surname, and the user has tried to submit, and the error validation is providing that information that they need. Preventing errors in the first place is the ultimate goal. So prevention is always better than the cure. And this can be achieved by having clear, visible labels that are as close to the input as possible, so that it's easy for a user to relate the label with the input. So this is one way of preventing errors in the first place. Making sure that those visible labels are then linked in code so that when a screen reader accesses the field, that label will be announced. And this can be done by using for and ID attributes as is shown on the slide. So on the slide, we have an input field for your name, and that visible label, your name, is linked in code using the for and ID attributes. Another way of preventing form errors is, in the first place, is by providing instructions and everything that's necessary for a user to fill in those fields without generating errors. So required and optional fields must be clearly labeled. All fields that require any specific formats, or if there's any rules, instructions, they must clearly describe these restrictions. And this can be done in a couple of ways. So it can either be provided at the start of the form or linked to the associated fields in code. So here on the slide, we have an example of that first approach where you put the instructions about required or optional fields at the top of the form. In this instance, we have a contact us feedback form. And before the inputs, there's a sentence that says all fields are mandatory unless marked optional. And so this is going to provide that information up front to all users, and it can prevent the situation where they're submitting a form when they haven't filled in required fields. The second way of providing these instructions and thereby preventing unnecessary errors is by any kind of instructions or format requirements, link them in code. So on the slide, we have markup that's illustrating this using the ARIA described by attribute. So we have an input, a text input, and the format requirement for this input is a specific date. So the date should be MM/YYYY. So that's the specific format that's required. Otherwise, an error would be generated. And so these instructions are being provided by this ID being linked to these instructions using ARIA described by. And what that will result in is, for a screen reader user, they'll tab to the input and it will announce the label, but it will also then announce this specific format that's required. And so this is all helping to prevent errors being generated in the first place. So which of the three approaches that we've looked at in this presentation is potentially the most accessible and usable? On the slide, we have a table showing each approach, and then 4 types of users with disability on the left, which are screen reader users, low vision, cognitively impaired, and speech recognition users. The first approach, the HTML disabled approach, impacts 3 out of 4 of these users. So it impacts screen reader users, low vision, and cognitively impaired. And as such, it's the least accessible and usable approach. The second is the ARIA disabled approach, which impacts 2 out of the 4 of these users. It impacts on cognitively impaired and speech recognition users. So an improvement on the HTML disabled attribute, but still has potential impacts on some users. How about the last approach? And that's the approach of not using disable control at all, but providing that feedback by error validation messages if necessary. So this last approach of not using disable controls is accessible and usable potentially to all 4 of the user disability categories. It's usable by screen reader users, low vision, cognitively impaired, and speech recognition users. And it provides an equivalent experience for all users. So in conclusion, what are the recommendations and how can we summarize what we've looked at in this presentation? Well, ideally, number 1, don't use disable controls if possible. Instead, keep buttons active and then just add validation if submission occurs prematurely. Trying to prevent errors being generated in the first place is the ultimate goal, and that can be done in various ways, but clear labeling, linking instructions to fields is some of the ways that we looked at. If you must disable a control, use the ARIA disabled attribute and then add those extra implementations that we discussed in order to make it more usable and accessible for all users. And last but not least, always carry out usability testing with people with disability to discover impacts of any approach taken. This is not just relevant to disabling controls or disabled controls, but any implementation, any digital product that we're designing and developing. We want to use people with disabilities throughout the whole process to feedback on design and how to improve the interaction and the experience. It can often highlight really key findings and also improve the product in terms of usability. Here are some great articles that other people have written on disabling controls that I would encourage you to check out, and these slides will be available for you all after the presentation. And that's the end of this discussion. I would love your feedback, love to chat. If you want to reach out, you can find me. Twitter handle is @new_Zoland. That's ZOELAND. And my email address is zoe.horton@intopia.digital. Thank you so much for listening.
AliCamp 2021.